Horror is not just seeing something approach. Horror is whispering in your ear. Right now. Welcome to PseudoPod, where adult content and horrific situations are in the room waiting for you.
PseudoPod, episode 902, for January 19th, 2024. The Ghost by Catherine Wells and 2:30 by Marjorie Bowen. Narrated by Louise Hewitt and Toll, respectively. Hosted by Gemma Amor. Audio by Chelsea Davis. Hello everyone, I hope you're all hale and healthy. I'm Gemma Amor, Bram Stoker and British Fantasy Award nominated author, illustrator and occasional podcaster and your host. I'm excited to tell you that this week we have two stories. 2:30 by Marjorie Bowen, read by Toll, and first published in the August 15, 1928 edition of the Daily Mail, and The Ghost by Catherine Wells, read by Louise Hewitt and first published in the Windsor magazine, May 1928. Marjorie Bowen, real name Margaret Gabrielle Vere Long, 1885 to 1952, was born in the hour between All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day and grew up in a haunted house. She became one of the most prolific Gothic authors of her time, whose influence is still felt today. Find out more about her by picking up the Bram Stoker award-winning book Monster She Wrote, written by our friends Lisa Kroger and Melanie R. Anderson. Amy Catherine Jane Wells, née Robbins, 1872 to 1927, was a versatile artist and writer. Her husband, H.G. Wells, collected her fiction into The Book of Catherine Wells in 1928, following her untimely death at age 55 the year before. She's known to have written at least two genre works, this story and another called Fear. As for our narrators, Toll has had a varied career, including as a hostage negotiator, car repairer and professional artist. He's currently a lawyer, mostly in the video gaming, AI and social media fields. Technically, he's been trained by ninjas and the SAS. In his own time, he's relearning French and the piano and taking up cage fighting. He summers on the Côte d'Azur and winters in London, England, and wonders if those two things are the right way around. Louise Hewitt is enthusiastic about stories in all their forms. She's an advertising copywriter by day, a reader of bedtime stories in the evenings, and a D&D dwarf cleric at the weekends. Lou to her friends, she enjoys cooking up a storm, riding her bike in the rain, feeding ducks, yoga, and attempting to meditate. Her favourite tales are about dragons, but pirates and sea serpents are also good. She lives in London, UK with her partner, her child on alternate weeks, and a very large ginger cat. This is her first time reading for PseudoPod. And now to our stories.
"2:30 by Marjorie Bowen. Narrated for you by Toll. The light had been put out on the stairs. Usually, when he returned late to spend the night in his rooms, he found it burning. Now he had to make his way slowly, striking matches as he went up the old dingy enclosed stairs. It was a long time since he had spent a night in this house, and he did not greatly care about doing so. It was an ancient, inconvenient residence, hidden away in a small square which had been half demolished, and was hemmed in on either side by massive modern buildings. Only when, as now, the young man had been detained so late at a dance that he had missed the last train to his home in the country, did he resort to the expedient of spending the night in this makeshift fashion. Roger Hoby knew that he would be alone in the house, as he always was when he spent the night there, with a great many other empty houses to right and left of him, and there was something in this silence more oppressive than the silence of the open country. So many buildings around him, so busy and crowded in the day, at night so empty and silent. And he blamed the caretaker who had not left the old-fashioned gas, for there was no electric light in the house, burning on the stairs. So heavy was the sense of oppression on him that he decided the next night he had to pass in town would be in a hotel. He found his own door, opened it, and entered the suite of chambers he occupied on the second floor, lit the gas in the first room, and passed into the second, which he used as his architect's office. It was a hateful, raw, cold and foggy night, and Roger Hoby was shuddering and shivering from having passed through the bitter, bleak streets and the damp cold of the dark stairway. He was therefore pleasantly amazed when he felt the genial warmth that met him as he opened the second door and saw the room full of all of his own familiar and pleasant possessions, brightly illuminated by the glow of a large fire. As he had not been there since the afternoon, he wondered who could have made up such a large fire to last until this late hour. The caretaker was seldom in the building after 6. Even as Hobie wondered, he noticed that someone was sitting in the large armchair drawn up by the fireplace, a man whose dark shape appeared to be one with that of the chair and was outlined against the bright blaze of the coals. "Hello!" cried Hobie, considerably startled, and not without an odd creep of fear in his blood, and more than ordinary amazement. The figure did not move. One hand was hanging over the edge of the armchair, and Hobie noticed that it was a peculiarly shaped hand with long, splay-ended fingers. Roger Hobie, advancing with considerable effort of will, almost laughed aloud with relief when he saw that the man whom he had seen sitting before the fire was Durant Loveday, who occupied the rooms above his own. He was a man with whom Hobie had no more than the most casual acquaintance, and for whom he did not greatly care. It was more than odd to find him sitting there at this hour. "Oh, it's you," said Loveday, and he seemed as relieved to see Hobie as Hobie had been to see him. "What do you want?" asked Roger briefly. "I didn't know you ever spent the night here. How did you get in?" "I don't ever spend the night here," replied Durant Loveday quickly. "This is the first time I've ever been here late. But then, you see, I have an appointment." "An appointment here at this hour?" "Yes. It sounds peculiar, doesn't it?" Roger Hobie thought it sounded very peculiar. He wondered that he had never noticed before that Loveday had such ugly splayed fingers, but then he'd never given him more than the most cursory glance on the stairs or in the street. He knew nothing at all about the fellow, and he had never liked the thin, dry face, the eyes that were too pale, too deeply cut and deeply set. All he knew of Loveday was that he also was an architect, and appeared to have an income independent of his work, which amounted to very little as far as Hobie knew. "Well, you didn't make an appointment here, I suppose?" said Hobie, warming himself before the fire, which his uninvited guest had kept so generously piled with coal. "No, it was because I decided not to keep my appointment that I came here," replied the other. "Someone was coming back for me, but I didn't want to see him." "How did you get in?" "I slipped in before your clerk went. I hid, and he went and left me, locked in." "Did he?" thought Hobie. "I'm glad you've come back," said Loveday in a confidential tone, leaning forward from the armchair. "I've been here for hours. I'm glad of your company. I kept on piling up the fire to make a bright light, but still, I'm glad of your company." "Well, I can't keep you company," replied Hobie. "I want to go to bed. It must be 2:00. Loveday put up his hand. His thick finger ends travelled over his thin lips, and those pale, deep-set eyes gazed at Hobie with an expression that the young man had never seen in a human face before, one of absolute terror. "Why, you're afraid!" cried Hobie involuntarily. "I've got an appointment," muttered Loveday, "at 2:30. Hobie went to his cupboard and set out the whisky and soda. "Look here," he said, in a voice he tried to make as practical as possible. "You'd better tell me what this is all about. You seem to have lost your nerve a bit, haven't you? What are you doing here, really? Hiding?" "There's someone coming back to see me at 2:30, cried Loveday. "Someone who I've been avoiding for years." "Then why on earth," asked Hobie, "did you make an appointment with him in such a place and at such an hour?" "He forced me," said Loveday, his voice falling to a whimper. "He forced me to it. You don't know what power he's got over me. I met him in the street, and then in a restaurant, but that wouldn't do. He would come here at 2:30. I didn't make the appointment, he did. He told me, 2:30 today, and I'll be there. He came and went without saying anything except, 'I'll be back at 2:30 tonight.'" "How is he going to get in?" asked Hobie. "I closed the door behind me." "He forced me to give him the pass-key," said Loveday. "He'll get in all right, but—" His voice dropped to an accent of cunning. "He'll go upstairs to the offices overhead. He won't think of looking for me here, and I'm locked in, aren't I?" "Yes, I shut the door," said Hobie doubtfully. He took a drink and gave one to Loveday, who, however, refused it. "You had better tell me what it's all about, hadn't you?" "It would be a very long story," grinned Loveday. "There's a great deal in it. In fact, there's everything in it." Then, seeing that Hobie had taken up some matches, he cried out, "Don't light the gas! He'll know there's somebody here, and then he might try to get in." But he can't, replied Hobie briefly, and we're 2-1 if he does. You don't know Stiffkey, said Loveday, still with a grin. Hobie put down the box of matches. The room was really sufficiently illuminated by the fire, and it occurred to him that if anyone did come, he would judge by firelight as easy as by gaslight that the room was occupied. He did not, however, mention this to Loveday. He had come to his own conclusions about him, the usual conclusions that the ordinary man comes to when faced with anything peculiar or extraordinary. He thought that Loveday was ill or out of his mind. Well, he remarked soothingly, you can have a shakedown here all night if you like. I sleep in the other room. There's a sofa there, too, if you would like it. But Loveday said no, he preferred to sit by the fire. He looked at the clock on the mantelpiece, which now showed 10 minutes past 2. No one will come, of course, thought Roger Hobie. The man's been badly scared by something, and this is the way it's taken him. He imagines an appointment with an enemy, but no one would come to such a place and at such a time. Observing again that snarl of terror on Loveday's face, he was, however, himself slightly affected by fear, and said, You had better really tell me something of what it's about, if you want me to stand by you in this, you know. I robbed Stiffkey, confessed Loveday, years ago, when we were in Africa. He entrusted me with something of his to sell, stones, and I brought them over to England and gave them to a jeweller to value. And then I told him that the jeweller had absconded with them. Of course, I had sold them and kept the money. That was the beginning of better times for me. I thought Stiffkey had died in Africa. I didn't hear from him for years. Hush! What was that? He paused to listen, and Hobie listened too, but there was no sound in the empty house. It sounds a pretty rotten sort of trick, said Hobie, drinking his whisky and soda. I wonder you care to talk about it. There are other things, said Loveday. We were great enemies, but for years I haven't seen him. I haven't thought about him until I met him just the other day, and he insisted on this appointment. To settle scores, he said. I offered him money, a great deal of money, but he said money wouldn't pay for all those years. Hush! I do think that's his step on the stairs. It isn't, said Hobie impatiently. There's no sound of anything. It's too silent. He went to the window. The fog is quite thick, he added. He'll find his way through the fog all right, answered Loveday faintly. He means to have his vengeance. Vengeance? Repeated Hobie. Do you think he'll come here to revenge himself on you? Of course, said Loveday, huddling himself together. He always said he'd get me in the end. Well, I shouldn't have met him in this place and at this time of night, replied Hobie, trying to speak with more confidence than he felt. He also found himself straining his ears to catch the possible sound of a footstep on the stairs, a rap, or a voice at the door. He would come, whimpered Loveday. It's his own fault he would come. Nothing else would do for him, and I was in his power, wasn't I? I'll be back, he said, at 2:30 tonight. Roger Hobie shuddered and drew nearer to the fire. He did not want to go to bed after all. He thought he'd prefer to sit up with Loveday, not leave him, anyhow, until after 2:30. The clock now showed 20 minutes past that hour. Hobie had no compassion for him. He never liked the man who, on his own showing, deserved no friendship or respect from anyone, a thief, a traitor, and a coward. No, Hobie had no compassion for him, but he was drawn to him by a stronger link than compassion, that of terror. He was infected by the fear that Loveday gave out, fear that was so definite that it seemed another personality in the room, and one that had laid its grip on Hobie, who was seized by this terror that had seized Loveday, and shuddering and dreading whoever it was, this Stiffkey, who was coming at 2:30. So strongly and suddenly did this terror overwhelm him, he made an impulsive movement towards the clock to stop the hands. Loveday, watching him, grinned. I thought of that, he said, but it's no use. There are other clocks outside. Look here, said Hobie roughly, trying to keep up his own courage. This is all nonsense, you know. You're imagining the whole thing. Nobody's coming, and even if they did— Loveday interrupted, more by his movement and his clutch on the arm of the chair, and the look on his face than by anything he said, though he did mutter for the third time, Hush! It sounds like the front door, said Hobie, opening and closing. Can't you hear? Whispered Loveday. There's someone coming up the stairs. No, I can't, said Hobie roughly. The clock on the mantelpiece struck 2:30. "Warmth! Warmth!" cried Loveday. "I want to get warm." He pulled his chair up to the fire, so closely it seemed that he must scorch. Hobie went into the outer room and listened. That shivering man was afraid of murder. There certainly was someone coming up the stairs, slowly and deliberately, as if unhindered by the dark. Hobie, moved by some unaccountable impulse of dread, saw that his own door was secure, and then returned to where Loveday crouched lower and lower over the fire. Hobie could still hear the footsteps, slow and deliberate. Had Stiffkey come with the purpose of murder? Hobie looked around, he did not know why, for a weapon, and picked up a heavy stone paperweight which had been laid carelessly on the chimney-piece to hold down a few odd papers beside the clock. He found it was wet. He dropped it, and holding his fingers into the firelight, saw they were red. "What's this? Blood?" cried Hobie. Loveday began to laugh. "Do you hear a footstep? 2:30, exactly to his appointment." Hobie could hear the footsteps. They had passed the door now. He could hear them overhead, tramping to and fro. He'd struck a match and was staring at the chimney-piece. The papers underneath the paperweight were splashed and spluttered with red. A thin, dark line was running down the wall. Hobie, looking up, saw that it was coming from a patch on the plastered ceiling, exactly where it met the wall, a patch that seemed to be spreading as he looked. Loveday's room was exactly overhead, by the dark patch on the plaster. "Up in your room," whispered Hobie, dropping the flaring match. "Stiffkey," grinned Loveday, staring. "Stiffkey." "And who else?" whispered Hobie. "Only Stiffkey," said Loveday. The steps were again crossing the room overhead and coming down the stairs. The two men listened, bending closer together, Loveday farther and farther leaning towards the fire. The footsteps paused at the outer door, and there was a sharp rap. "I won't let him in," whispered Hobie. "It doesn't matter whether you do or not," whimpered Loveday. "The door is open." "No, I shut the door." But even as the young man spoke, he felt a draught of cold outer air. Driven by panic, he went into the outer room. The door, which he was certain he had closed, stood open on the black staircase. The sound of footsteps had departed in the direction of Loveday, but he saw no one. Then he heard Loveday from behind him give a gurgle and a shriek of incredible anguish, and he did not dare go back to the fire. He knew that it was useless to do so, that Loveday was dead. It was quite a long time before he was able to return to the room, light the gas, and stare at Loveday, rigid in his chair, beneath that red patch on the ceiling. Hobie had known that he would be there alone. The fog was now so thick that even with the gaslight, everything looked dim, monstrous, and misshapen. Torn by a fearful curiosity, Roger Hobie went up into Loveday's chambers. They were not locked. Hobie, striking matches, found what he had expected to find, a dead man lying by the wainscot, who had been battered to death by the poker which lay beside him. His watch was staring on the floor beside him. It had stopped at 2:30, which must have been the hour when Loveday murdered him. The appointment was for 2:30, but in the afternoon, not in the night. He had said he would return. But who was the other? For whom had Loveday waited all those hours, first upstairs and then hiding down in Hobie's room? Stiffkey, returning to keep his second appointment again, the next time the clock was at 2:30?
The Ghost by Catherine Wells, narrated by Louise Hewitt. She was a girl of 14, and she sat propped up with pillows in an old four-poster bed, coughing a little with the feverish cold that kept her there. She was tired of reading by lamplight, and she lay and listened to the few sounds that she could hear, and looked into the fire. From downstairs, down the wide, rather dark, oak-panelled corridor hung with brown ochre paintings of tremendous naval engagements exploding fierily at their centres. Down the broad stone stairs that ended in a heavy, creaking, nail-studded door. There blew into her remoteness sometimes a gust of dance music. Cousins and cousins and cousins were down there, and Uncle Timothy as host, leading the fun. Several of them had danced into her room during the day, and said that her illness was a perfect shame, and told her that the skating in the park was too heavenly, and danced out again. Uncle Timothy had been as kind could be. But downstairs, all the full cup of happiness the lonely child had looked forward to so eagerly for a month was running away like liquid gold. She watched the flames of the big wood fire in the open grate flicker and fall. She had sometimes to clench her hands to prevent herself from crying. She had discovered, so early was she beginning to collect her little stock of feminine lore, that if you swallowed hard and rapidly as the tears gathered, that you could prevent your eyes brimming over. She wished someone would come. There was a bell within her reach, but she could think of no plausible excuse for ringing it. She wished there were more light in the room. The big fire lit up cheerfully when the logs flared high, but when they only glowed, the dark shadows crept down from the ceiling and gathered in the corners against the panelling. She turned from the scrutiny of the room to the bright circle of light under the lamp on the table beside her, and the companionable suggestiveness of the currant jelly and spoon, grapes and lemonade, and the little pile of books and kindly fuss that shone warmly and comfortingly there. Perhaps it would not be long before Mrs. Bunting, her uncle's housekeeper, would come in again and sit down and talk to her. Mrs. Bunting, very probably, was more occupied than usual that evening. There were several extra guests. Another house party had motored over for the evening, and they had brought with them a romantic figure, a celebrity, no less a personage than the actor Percival East. The girl had indeed broken down from her fortitude that afternoon when Uncle Timothy had told her of this visitor. Uncle Timothy was surprised. It was only another schoolgirl who would have understood fully what it meant to be denied by a mere cold the chance of meeting face to face that chivalrous hero of drama. Another girl who had glowed at his daring, wept at his noble renunciations, been made happy, albeit enviously and vicariously, by his final embrace with the lady of his love. There, dear child," Uncle Timothy had said, patting her shoulder and greatly distressed. Never mind. If you can't get up, I'll bring him in to see you here. I promise I will. But the pull these chaps have over you little women," he went on, half to himself. The panelling creaked. Of course, it always did in these old houses. She was of that order of apprehensive, slightly nervous people, who do not believe in ghosts, but all the same hope devoutly they may never see one. Surely it was a long time since anyone had visited her. It would be hours, she supposed, before the girl who had the room next to her own, into which a communicating door comfortingly led, came up to bed. If she rang, it took a minute or two before anyone reached her from the remote servants' quarters. There ought soon, she thought, to be a housemaid about the corridor outside, tidying up the bedrooms, putting coal on the fires, and making such like companionable noises. That would be pleasant. How bored one got in bed anyhow, and how dreadful it was, how unbearably dreadful it was that she should be stuck in bed now, missing everything, missing every bit of the glorious, glowing time that was slipping away down there. And at that she had to begin swallowing her tears again. With a sudden burst of sound, a storm of clapping and laughter, the heavy door at the foot of the stairs swung open and closed. Footsteps came upstairs and she heard men's voices approaching. Uncle Timothy. He knocked at the door ajar. "Come in," she cried gladly. With him was a quiet-faced, greyish-haired man of middle age. The uncle had sent for the doctor after all. "Here is another of your young worshippers, Mr. East," said Uncle Timothy. Mr. East! She realised in a flash that she'd expected him to be in purple brocade, powdered hair and ruffles of fine lace. Her uncle smiled at her disconcerted face. She doesn't seem to recognise you, Mr. East, said Uncle Timothy. Of course I do, she declared bravely, and sat up, flushed with excitement and feverishness, bright-eyed and with ruffled hair. Indeed, she began to see the stage hero she remembered, and the kindly-faced man before her flowed together like a composite portrait. There was the little nod of the head, there was the chin, yes, and the eyes, now she came to look at them. Why were they all clapping you? She asked. Because I just promised to frighten them out of their wits, replied Mr. East. Oh, how? Mr. East, said Uncle Timothy, is going to dress up as our long-lost ghost and give us a really shuddering time of it downstairs. Are you? Cried the girl with all the fierce desire that only a girl can utter in her voice. Oh, why am I like this, Uncle Timothy? I'm not really ill at all. Can't you see I'm better? I've been in bed all day. I'm perfectly well. Can't I come down, Uncle dear? Can't I? In her excitement, she was half out of bed. There, child, soothed Uncle Timothy, hastily smoothing the bedclothes and trying to tuck her in. But can't I? Of course, if you want to be thoroughly frightened out of your wits, mind you, began Percival East. I do, she cried, bouncing up and down in her bed. I'll come and show myself when I'm dressed up, before I go down. Oh, please, she cried back radiantly. A private performance, all to herself. Will you be perfectly awful? She laughed exultantly. As ever I can, smiled Mr. East, and turned to follow Uncle Timothy out of the room. You know, he said, holding the door and looking back at her with mock seriousness, I shall look rather horrid, I expect. Are you sure you won't mind? Mind when it's you? Laughed the girl. He went out of the room, shutting the door. Rum-ti-dum-tum-ti-dum-tum, she hummed gaily, and wriggled down into her bedclothes again, straightening the sheet over her chest, and prepared to wait. She lay quietly for some time, with a smile on her face, thinking of Percival East and fitting his grave, kindly face back into its various dramatic settings. She was quite satisfied with him. She began to go over in her mind in detail the last play in which she had seen him act. How splendid he had looked when he fought the duel! She couldn't imagine him gruesome, she thought. What would he do with himself? Whatever he did, she wasn't going to be frightened. He shouldn't be able to boast he'd frightened her. Uncle Timothy would be there too, she supposed. Would he? Footsteps went past her door outside, along the corridor, and died away. The big door at the end of the stairs opened and clanged shut. Uncle Timothy had gone down. She waited on. A log burned through the middle to a ruddy thread, fell suddenly in 2 tumbling pieces on the hearth. She started at the sound. How quiet everything was! How much longer would he be, she wondered. The fire wanted making up, the pieces of wood collecting together. Should she ring? Oh, but he might come in when the servant was mending the fire, and that would thoroughly spoil his entry. The fire could wait. The room was very still, and, with the fallen fire, darker. She heard no more any sound at all from downstairs. That was because her door was shut. All day it had been open, but now the last slender link that had held her to downstairs was broken. The flame gave a sudden fitful leap. Why? Was it going out, was it? No. She hoped he wouldn't jump out at her, but of course he wouldn't. Anyhow, whatever he did, she wouldn't be frightened. Not really frightened. Forewarned is forearmed. Was that a sound? She started up, her eyes on the door. Nothing. But surely the door had minutely moved. It did not sit back quite so close into its frame. Perhaps she was sure it had moved. Yes, Yes, it had moved, opened an inch, and slowly, as she watched, she saw a thread of light grow between the edge of the door and its frame, grow almost imperceptibly wider, and stop. He could never come through that. It must have yawned open of its own accord. Her heart began to beat rather quickly. She could see only the upper part of the door. The foot of her bed hid the lower third. Her attention tightened. Suddenly as a pistol shot, she saw there was a little figure like a dwarf near the wall, between the door and the fireplace. It was a little cloaked figure, no higher than the table. How did he do it? It was moving slowly, very slowly toward the fire, as if it were quite unconscious of her. It was wrapped about in a cloak that trailed, with a slouched hat on its head bent down to its shoulders. She gripped the clothes with her hands. It was so queer, so unexpected. She gave a little gasp of a laugh to break the tension of the silence, to show she appreciated him. The dwarf stopped dead at the sound, turned its face round to her. Oh, but she was frightened. It was a dead white face, a long pointed face hunched between its shoulders. There was no colour in the eyes that stared at her. How did he do it? How did he do it? It was too good. She laughed again nervously, with a clutch of terror she could not control. She saw the creature move out of the shadow and come towards her. She braced herself with all her might. She mustn't be frightened by a bit of acting. He was coming nearer. It was horrible, horrible, right up to her bed. She flung her head beneath her bedclothes. Whether she screamed or not, she never knew. Someone was rapping at her door, speaking cheerily. She shook her head out of the clothes with a revulsion of shame at her fright. The horrible little creature was gone. Mr. East was speaking at her door. What was it he was saying? What? "I'm ready now," he said. "Shall I come in and begin?"
Well done, you've survived another episode. What did you think of The Ghost by Catherine Wells or 2:30 by Marjorie Bowen? If you're a Patreon subscriber, we encourage you to pop over to our Discord channel and let us know. As for me, 2:30 does a wonderful job of infusing dread into a simple and sparse setting. The concept of revenge or a vendetta is not new with ghost stories. In fact, vengeful ghosts have existed in mythology and folklore far more ancient than this tale, from ancient Rome's Lemures to Japan's Onryo or Onryo. Apologies for my pronunciation. Many countries and cultures across the world have their own version, but what I like about Bowen's revenge-seeking Stiffkey, incidentally, there is a small village in Norfolk not far from where I grew up called Stiffkey, only we pronounce it Stooky, which is thoroughly confusing but also rather pleasing on the tongue, is that his motivations are very straightforward. He was robbed by Loveday, his life was subsequently ruined, and so his adversary's life is now forfeit. I have to say, it's hard to feel sorry for Loveday, who is, after all, a thieving tow rag. I do feel sorry, however, for the unwitting witness Roger Hobie, if nothing else for the sheer horror of returning to your property late at night, tired and cold, to find you have unexpected company. Not only that, but they've made their way through a good chunk of your coal reserves in your absence, and I have to wonder if perhaps Loveday was simply trying to cut down on his heating bill. As for The Ghost by Catherine Wells, this is a neat and masterful example of what the promise of a haunting can do to the psyche. I think it's a brilliant move to tell the story from the perspective of a bed-bound young girl, not that dissimilar to the protagonist in the yellow wallpaper. Convalescence and haunting seem to go hand in hand, and it works rather well, I think, for it traps the protagonist in a state that's not easy to run from, which makes a difference as far as unwelcome visitors go, ghostly or otherwise. I should point out that height or lack thereof should not be the main qualifier for terror-inducing ghouls, monsters and whatnot, but those were different times, I suppose. The point of this story, unfortunate stereotyping aside, is that anticipation can be very powerful. We'll never know if the girl, who remains unnamed, actually saw what she thought she saw, or whether her mind, amped up, excited, nervous and fevered, simply created a nightmare for her, a literal fever dream brought on by her flu. Imagination is a wonderful thing, especially in the young and incapacitated, and the girl has been lying alone listening to the sounds of merriment taking place without her for hours. It's not impossible that she dived into fantasy as a way of escaping her boredom. However, we just don't know, and those are the kinds of ghost stories I like best. Now, on the subject of support, PseudoPod is funded by you, our listeners. We pay everyone and we're very proud of that, but this relies on your generosity. As always, if you can, please go to pseudopod.org and donate by clicking on Feed the Pod. If you can't afford to do that, and we understand times are very tight, then please consider leaving reviews of our episodes, or generally talking about them on whichever social media platform seems the least terrible this week. By the way, we now have a Blue Sky account. You can find us at pseudopod.org. And if you like merch, Escape Artists also has a Void merch store with a huge range of fabulous hoodies, t-shirts and other goodies. The link is in various places, including our pinned tweet. Because they're tweets, aren't they? They're still tweets. Check it out. PseudoPod is part of the Escape Artists Foundation, a 501c3 non-profit, and this episode is distributed under the Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Download and listen to the episode on any device you like, but don't change it or sell it. Theme music is by permission of Anders Manga. See you soon, folks. Take care and stay safe.
An arm appeared from nowhere on the shape, seemingly projected like the pseudopod of a protozoan.
It's a pseudopod. It's a big foot.
It's all about podcasts these days.